Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope you're doing well. Welcome to November, welcome to book one of the Histories of Herodotus. Here lies Herodotus, so let's jump in. Herodotus, of course, is going to display his inquiry, and he doesn't want us to forget human achievements. And the idea that it's not strictly the Greeks who are going to be, detailed and celebrated and explored, but non-Greeks will be as well. And he wants to know why on earth are the Greeks and Persians fighting each other. And he gives us 2 pages in which he catalogs a series of crimes, among them the abduction of Helen by, the classical rape of Helen by Paris of Troy, and the subsequent Trojan War, and the idea that going and wiping out an entire city for someone from the city stealing a woman was unheard of. But he also has this weird aside on Helen. He goes, he ends this preface sort of with, so much for what Persians and Phoenicians say, and I have no intention of passing judgment on its truth or falsity. I prefer to rely on my own knowledge and to point out who it was in actual fact that first injured the Greeks. Then I will proceed with my history. Then I will proceed with my history is going to take a while. We don't get to it today. Telling the story as I go along of small cities of men no less than of great. And this is probably the most important sentence in this first part. For most of those which were great once are small today, and those which used to be small were great in my own time. Knowing therefore that human prosperity never abides long in the same place, I shall pay attention to both alike. And that's critical. Herodotus introduces this idea that history is somewhat cyclical, that not only human beings, rise and fall, but cities or nations rise and fall. And he very much views himself and his history as part of that narrative. What he's going to detail is going to show this time and again. We see it in 2 very obvious places in book 1, and 2 less obvious places, I think. So he starts telling us about Croesus, the fantastically wealthy king of Lydia. A lot of times Croesus is mentioned in elementary school history textbooks as the guy who first came up with currency or coinage, and sort of helping replace the barter economy. And the reason he wants to talk about Croesus is because Croesus is the first non-Greek, the first foreigner, specifically the first non-Greek from Western Asia to really come into contact with what Herodotus sort of thinks of as the modern, I realize we're talking about 5th, 6th century BC, the modern, Greek cities. And so we're going to talk about Croesus. And then, he introduces that, and then it's like, hey, let's go have some bazaar gossip. And he has 2 just absolutely fantastic ones. The first is an example of that rise and fall, and it's very quick. It takes 2 paragraphs almost. And it's the famous story of Candaules, the legendary king of Lydia, who is convinced that his wife is just absolutely stunning, the most gorgeous one who's ever lived. I can sympathize with Candaules because I view my wife that way, and I'm accurate. And perhaps Candaules was. The problem is that Candaules is also a fool. And he decides he can't, and Herodotus, of course, is using this as sort of his first example of rise and fall. We have a very powerful king who's married to what he regards as the most beautiful woman on earth. What a great life. But he can't be satisfied there. He has to constantly brag about it, and it's that example of hubris, and he's constantly bragging about to his best friend, this retainer of his Gyges, and then he contrives this awful plot to have Gyges see his wife, when she's undressed. What a creep. Gyges hides behind the door, sees Candaules' wife, who's infamously not named. Thankfully, we will get some other queens or individuals throughout the book, not just Greeks but non-Greeks, who will be named. Semiramis and Tomiris pop up in book 1. So Gyges sees Candaules' wife, and when he goes to sneak out the door, she realizes what's happened, calls him in the next day and says, you get a choice. Either you must die for doing what should not have been done, and seeing what you should not have seen, or you need to kill the king who disgraced me, and, that will expiate your guilt. Well, Gyges, of course, makes the decision to stay alive and murders Candaules. And so there we have our first rise and fall, a man who seemingly had it all, and, because of his arrogance, because of his pride, because he has to be this, creeptastic braggart, is killed. And Gyges is now the new dynasty that is overthrowing the line of Heracles that was on the throne. And it's interesting that Herodotus doesn't really go into Heracles was a god or any of that. He just says, it was the line of Heracles. And then we get our next important, so we have our first rise and fall, and then we get our next really important mention, super duper critical. And Herodotus just kind of lays it in the lines there, which is, oh yeah, this was a new dynasty, and Gyges later had his dynasty and his right to rule confirmed by the oracle at Delphi. That's going to be really important. We see the oracle at Delphi later with Croesus and his brilliant strategies, and then we're going to see the oracle again at a couple of critical junctures, and Herodotus also gives a little tell on this, which is that after he mentions that the oracle confirmed that Gyges would rule and that his dynasty would rule for 5 generations, and then there would be some type of revenge for this murder of Candaules. Well, Gyges just decides, man, the oracle deserves all of these gifts. And by gifts, maybe we could start reading the word bribes, because every time the oracle at Delphi gets mentioned from here on out, we're going to start hearing some info about cash. And not so much cash, but just fabulous amounts of gold, fabulous amounts of silver, statues, Croesus is going to send enormous quantities of wealth to Delphi. And Herodotus he never outright says at this early point, these were all a bunch of bribes. But he's willing to hint at it a little bit. So we have our first mention of the oracle of Delphi. Very important. He then starts to go on and talk about Gyges very briefly, he wasn't really that important beyond his bribes and killing Candaules. He then goes on and talks about Gyges' various descendants until we really get to Croesus, who he's going to spend quite a bit of time on, and is really one of the 2 main characters of Book 1 along with Cyrus. But he goes, oh, by the way, in this one person train, there was this extraordinary event that occurred, and they talk about it all the time in Corinth. And it, of course, is Arion, who gets to ride a dolphin and is saved when he goes, and he's just a fabulous singer. He has this money. The sailors decide, we're going to, rob him and murder him and throw him overboard. Or he can kill himself and we'll bury him ashore. And he goes, well, I want to sing. So he sings, and when he throws himself overboard, a dolphin that was just astonished by his music saves him. And he rides the dolphin back to safety, and then later is able to expose the thieving sailors who wanted it to murder him. And Herodotus goes, and there's a statue of him riding a dolphin at this temple. And it's just great. Herodotus is essentially taking us into the rumor mill and then into the cul-de-sac of the fantastic. And I think Herodotus does it intentionally to sort of say, look, I'm going to tell you stuff that I've come across on my, the histories really are the inquiries. This is just a guy who goes around and asks everybody questions and finds out stuff. There's some evidence he didn't speak or read Persian, but he just keeps asking questions, and he does travel some. So he's just going to tell you what his inquiries have brought to him, even though some of it might be a little bit ridiculous. So we have that, and then we go back to Croesus, and we get some descriptions of how Croesus is very wealthy, and then there's a critical interaction, and it goes back to the interaction, the paragraph where Herodotus was talking about, I'm going to tell you about, this cycle that's going on, that what was great becomes small, and what is now great was once small, and I'm going to show you that cycle, both with cities and with people. And so we have the interaction between Croesus and Solon, a great lawgiver in Athens in the 6th-ish century, who seems to have actually existed. but probably never actually met Croesus. And so we also get these like great interactions. It's possible that someone who sort of was of the school of Solon and, you know, was sort of a follower later on of valuing Solon's wisdom, had this interaction with Croesus. Quite possible that that happened. And Croesus, of course, asks, you know, who is the happiest person alive? We have a sort of Disney mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the happiest of them all? And Croesus, of course, expects to hear himself. And Solon goes, well, it's this guy, you know, who lived a really great life and died fighting for his country. Like, that's when you know you've lived. Croesus is like, okay. Well, who was second? Well, there were these brothers who... and you just see, Croesus is super wealthy. Like, nobody says no to this guy. And he's just almost enraged that Solon is just, like, tweaking him a little bit. And he goes, well, what about me? You know, what about me? How can you say that I'm not the happiest man? And I'm like, look what I have. Remember Candaules? Solon then points out, well, you can't know until you get to the end of a person's arc, at the end of a person's life, because we don't know what's going to happen. You know, you don't know how it's going to end. And it isn't just about the moment and the present, but it's how everything ends, like the full arc, the full legacy. And Croesus, of course, just sort of scoffs at this. But we're getting, of course, a foreshadowing of what will happen to Croesus, a foreshadowing of what is going to happen throughout the histories. And you also have almost this sense of, like, the mutability cantos from Edmund Spenser, you know, nature doth change delight, that everything is going to be changing. And so we get that with Croesus, who decides, you know, he's hearing these rumors about Persians over there, or the Medians over in the east, not the Persians yet, the Medians, and you know, maybe he needs to go to war with them. And of course, he has come into contact with the Greeks sort of for two reasons. He's had some issues with the Greek colonies along Western Asia Minor, or now known as Turkey. He's had some conflicts with those cities. He, you know, had some success with the land ones. He thought about building a fleet to go try to take out the islands, and it was pointed out to him that that would be a terrible idea. And that's about the only time Croesus actually listens to reason. Throughout book one, Croesus continually is just sort of, you know, like Candaules and like Cyrus later on, you know, filled with hubris and just overreaching, if you will. So Croesus decides maybe he should go to war. And we get this great tale about how he became enamored with the oracle at Delphi. And one other, but we don't get the details, and that he had sent off messengers to all the oracles to ask, like, what am I doing on the 100th day? And the oracle at Delphi, of course, mentions something about, like, a turtle and, you know, lamb and bronze, and he's like, oh, I was making a stew that day, just in that way. And of course, Croesus then heaps on the bribes and wants to know all about what will happen. You know, should I go to war with Persia? Should I go to war with Persia? And, you know, this upstart Cyrus. And they say, well, if you go to war with Persia, you will destroy a great empire. And he's like, yes. Herodotus also knows, he tells us 3 times before the end who wins the war between Lydia and Persia. I'd like to characterize, though, that pretty much anybody who was reading the histories when Herodotus wrote them, or was, of course, he recited, certainly, especially in the early books, probably the first 3 books, he recited portions of those probably before he had finished the full work. Everybody knew the end of that war. Everybody knew what had happened. Everybody also knew what had happened in the later, you know, in the actual Greco-Persian wars he's going to write about. But everybody knows who wins that. So it's not a surprise, but it is funny to see a historian who sort of is just like giving away the chronological game 3 times before getting into the actual war between Croesus and Cyrus. And of course, Croesus does go to war. He does destroy a great empire. It's his own. He and Cyrus fight to a standstill. Croesus goes home to Sardis. He basically sends his mercenaries home. He says, everybody go home for the winter. Cyrus force marches, follows along, and then attacks He wins a victory, and we don't get a huge description of battles in the histories. We will later on, but there's plenty of times we don't really get a lot of description of the battles. It's not like Xenophon, who was a soldier and really interested in battles and tactics and things like that. Herodotus is just a curious dude. He's inquisitive. But we do get this detail about how Cyrus used camels to sort of break the charge of the Lydian cavalry, which was their best force, and then push them back into Sardis. And they finally like climb up the mountain sort of to invade the city and take it. They consider killing Croesus and burning him alive. And there is this moment where Herodotus gives this, imbues this humanity. He wasn't there to hear these words. This occurred early enough that probably no one alive was still around to tell Herodotus what had happened. Like almost certainly, like there was no extant witness to like detail this story to Herodotus, but it was probably passed down. It would have been a big enough deal when Cyrus did capture Sardis that people probably paid some attention to the interactions between Croesus and Cyrus and would have been able to share that. But Herodotus undoubtedly makes up aspects of it. And so we do have Croesus is there. Cyrus shows mercy to Croesus. We also have an interesting bit in there where Croesus is told, seek an alliance with the Greeks. And so he decides to find out which of the Greek cities is the strongest. And he sort of finds out, well, Athens is an option and Sparta's an option. And these are really our only mentions of Athens and Sparta. Sparta pops up like one more time, but really this is the only mention of Athens in the entirety of Book 1. And it's that they're ruled by the Pisistratids. And that Pisistratus has had he's in his third tyranny at this time and has, found various ways to connive the rule of Athens, including dressing up a really tall woman to look like the goddess Athena and convincing everybody that she is bringing him back to Athens to escort him to the Acropolis. But it's important to note a lot of readers of the book don't realize that Athens, while famous for its highly exclusive democracy, not everybody got to vote, not even all the men got to vote, highly exclusive democracy, that democracy had not, Athens did not exist forever that way, and in fact had been in the throes of tyranny right up until shortly before the Greco-Persian Wars started. And then there will be another tyranny at the end of the Peloponnesian War, at the end of the 5th century. So that's just an important detail. We are told, though, about Sparta and how they don't cut their hair. They fought the Argives, they don't cut their hair. And so Croesus, of course, is probably the largest example of Herodotus's, cycle motif, that you have this extraordinarily wealthy person. He expects to be the happiest man alive. He's told, go to war and you'll destroy a great empire. And then it all comes to a collapse. And we'll see that again. We're going to see, we'll see it with Cyrus in this book, but we'll see it with others, somewhat notably, certain Persians later on. And then we get some details around what happens to the Lydian kingdom, how a royal subsidiary of Cyrus, basically goes, Pargus goes and conquers various cities. There's a great detail about one that tries to dig a channel to turn their peninsula into an island, and then they get a little message saying if Zeus wanted to make it an island, he would have made it an island. But there's a terraforming attempt. So there are some atrocities. And we get the biography of Cyrus, which is Croesus is sort of the major character of Book 1, but Cyrus is very much like 1A. And Cyrus is historically, I think, far more important than Croesus. He is a grandson of the Median king. The daughter is married off to a Persian after this series of dreams that we get. And dreams in, classical history are always really fascinating. The one about, urine flooding Asia is just fantastic. I don't know if Herodotus made that up, and that's one of Herodotus's lies, according to Plutarch. But that's an incredible visual and image. It's highly specific. It's really weird. And the second dream is just as weird. But Astyages, who's not a really pleasant person, he's a jerk. He of course is paranoid. This is and we see Cyrus is supposed to be exposed. First of all, his mother is married off to a lowly Persian, out on the edge of the empire, this frontier place. Nothing good comes from there. And then even then, there's another dream. So Cyrus is supposed to be exposed, and of course he isn't. He's raised by a herdsman, and that herdsman's wife, Cyno, which means dog, and because it's a woman, the female dog. And so that Herodotus explains as the legend of Cyrus being, raised by a she-wolf or a she-dog, and suckled by her, is because the shepherd's wife was named Cyno, which is the name for dog. And it's a familiar story. Romulus and Remus famously have almost an exact repetition with that. We have Alexandros, or Paris, from the Trojan War in the Iliad, who is supposed to be exposed and is raised by a shepherd. Moses, within at the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, is almost an inversion of that, where instead of the child being exposed and raised by commoners who's royal, it's the slave child who is raised by a royal. And so Moses is an interesting inversion of that. So we have that aspect of Cyrus, and then of course the detail about playing king as a boy and being outed as an actual royal, and then gradually rising in power, and the really horrible detail around Hubris and what happened to his son, and how he's willing to conspire with Cyrus for revenge, and then becomes a key ally and sort of is the one who goes and subjugates Asia Minor, while Cyrus goes off and wins battles. We go to Babylon, and this is an interesting one where Herodotus' description of Babylon's walls and various other parts, highly specific and highly accurate. Really, really interesting how accurate about numerous details Herodotus is. And Semiramis, historically accurate. Nocritis, the other queen he mentions, doesn't seem to actually have existed historically. And some of the things he describes there are probably things Nebuchadnezzar was doing. The one thing Herodotus doesn't mention about Babylon, and he goes into detail about how they make their bricks, and the bricks were part of the reason the walls, some of the walls and structures of Babylon don't exist anymore is because the bricks were considered so good, people would go steal them to use for other structures because the Babylonian bricks were considered so solid and sturdy, high quality bricks. There's a joke in there somewhere about some modern analogy. But the one thing Herodotus doesn't mention about Babylon, this is really interesting, is he doesn't talk about the Hanging Gardens at all. So that is one of the reasons some historians think that maybe he didn't actually ever go to Babylon. He just had incredibly detailed info about Babylon. We also suspect he doesn't speak Persian because he makes the mention of, hey, all the Persian names end in S: Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Hipparchus, numerous Cambyses, all of these Persians that we were meeting, their names end in S. But that only happens in Greek, so it's quite possible he doesn't actually speak Persian. But he does mention some Persian customs quite accurately, particularly the reverence for dogs, and that dogs were, they will eat or harm pretty much anything except for humans and dogs. And that's a critical piece. That was a critical aspect of Zoroastrianism. And we do get we end with some great little details about the Caspian Sea, which Herodotus correctly identifies is not connected by major waterways to the Mediterranean Sea or the Great Oceans, and he correctly identifies that the Indian and Atlantic Ocean connect in some way. He had never traveled that. but he does correctly intuit that. And then we finally, we end with two important pieces. One is the first mentions of Darius, who will later, or Darius, who will later rise to the Persian throne and will be a critical figure at the beginning of the Greco-Persian Wars, much later on. And a mention about Darius like being a avaricious, punk who goes and desecrates a grave to find the treasures that are inside and finds nothing in there except a taunt about how greedy whoever desecrated the grave was. But there is a mention of Darius. And then we get the final big arc example Herodotus wants to show us, which is that of Cyrus, who late in his life, having won pretty much every war he ever fought, just about every battle he'd ever fought, goes and presses beyond the borders, way out into northeastern, from his sphere, northeast from his sphere, into Eastern Asia, and dies in battle against Tomyris, having taken strategic advice from Croesus, the Lydian of all people, who is the worst strategist in Book 1, but says, well, if you invite him over. So we end, of course, with the death of Cyrus. And so our two main characters, Croesus and Cyrus, are linked, even right up there at the end, because it's Croesus' advice. And we have seen the rise and fall of two major kings just in Book 1. Now, as always, I really do hope you enjoyed it. We're going to pick up next Sunday with books 2 and 3, which are going to deal with the reign of Cyrus' son Cambyses, and Persia decides to invade Egypt, and so we're going to find out a lot about Egypt from what Herodotus understands. So leave your comments. Happy to hear what you think. And again, I really hope that this week starts well for everybody. Thanks. Bye.